Well, it's now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Chris Hook. Dr. Hook is a professor and a hematologist at Mayo Clinic, and he's actively involved in providing bioethics leadership at Mayo Clinic and far beyond Mayo Clinic. In fact, he may truly be called the founding pioneer of bioethics at Mayo Clinic, given the fact that he founded the ethics consultation services at Mayo Clinic, both at the Rochester location and the Jacksonville location, the Mayo Reproductive Medicine Advisory Board, Mayo's Transplantation Ethics Advisory Board, and the Mayo Clinical Ethics Council, which is now the Enterprise Office of Clinical Ethics, where he continues to serve today. In addition to his distinguished medical and bioethical work at Mayo, Dr. Hook serves as a professor here in Trinity's master's degree program in bioethics and as a senior fellow at Trinity's Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. He's been involved in many significant book projects, including the books Cutting Edge Bioethics and Biotechnology and the Human Good. And his CV is so substantial that I weighed the merits of taking 15 minutes of his lecture time for the introduction or just turning things right over to Dr. Hook, and I decided to go with the latter. So will you please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Christopher Hook.
Thank you, brother. Oh, sorry. Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. It's very nice to see you. I want to thank John and Dr. Dockery and Paige for the very kind honor and privilege to be able to be with you tonight for this lecture series, which I hope this will be the first of many, many to come. I always have to begin with a few disclosures. First, there are no conflicts of interest that I have to report here. My comments are solely my own and do not necessarily represent the views of Mayo Clinic. I will also state, by way of disclosure, that as a physician, I have professed before God to honor the life of every human being who is brought into my care and to recognize within them His image. I have pledged that I will not take that life deliberately, and it is based upon that profession that I have the thoughts that I have to share with you tonight about a very contentious issue now in our society, and that is of conscientious objection. So just a brief outline of what I hope to cover in the next hour. First, we'll obviously need to define what is conscience and an associated concept of complicity. Which is where some of the sticky points in conscientious objection often occur. Just do a very brief review of the freedom of conscience in the First Amendment to set the stage for understanding where we came about as a society and our valuing of conscience. And we can then contrast how things are going today to that. We'll spend a fair amount of time on the current war on conscience, and I want to have us consider the consequences for medicine and for each and every one of us as patients if we eradicate a freedom of conscience. And lastly, because I have been involved in efforts at my institution to strike the balance that is required in protecting conscience in a secular institution, I want to share with you at least part of the journey that we've gone through in trying to address that. So, in terms of what is conscience, if you talk to people, or even if you look in dictionaries, you may find a number of different approaches to trying to understand or define conscience. Some would say that it is an inner sense of what is right or wrong in one's conduct or motives, impelling one toward right actions. This is almost a non-rational or subjective or unconscious leaning that is occurring. Another approach would be to say that it is the complex of ethical and moral principles that controls or inhibits the actions or thoughts of an individual. And this is leaning more toward an intellectual, a specific rational or cognitive approach. One is to say this is simply to feel guilty about something as an act that one considers wrong, a more emotive definition. Fourth would be the motivation deriving logically from ethical or moral principles that govern a person's thoughts and actions. Here I'm going to refer to this more as the informed or trained conscience. And lastly, it is an internal accountability to God and God's natural law, a spiritual approach to conscience. Despite all these different definitions, we can see that conscience is a fairly universal experience and concept. Because if you look in languages around the world, each of them have a term specifically for conscience as being sort of a universal human phenomenon. The Greeks' term syndioresis states that this is an inherent and interior quality of ethical discernment. Now, as I go a little further into defining the conscience, I'm going to be drawing upon a little book that I strongly recognize to any student that wants to consider this more specifically from a Christian perspective. Conscience, What It Is, How to Train It, and Loving Those Who Differ by Naselli and Crowley. Now, you may ask, why am I going straight away to a more religiously based or theologically oriented approach to conscience? It is simply because if you go to other sources that you would think as providing us guidance, such as the DMS-5 of the American Psychiatric Association, there is no attempt to define conscience within the psychological or psychiatric communities. The closest they come to is in reference to certain types of antisocial pathologies in which they describe an element of those psychopathologies or sociopathologies as an absence of guilt or remorse. But there's no positive component of that, and therefore they miss a substantial part of what conscience is. So moving on to Naselli and Crowley, they say that conscience is a human capacity, and by that they say it is something that must be developed and used. Conscience reflects the moral aspects of God's image, that conscience feels independent. It's a separate voice of judgment. We see from these passages in Romans where it's referred to, if you will, this sense of judgment that occurs in contrast to the law written on the heart. So there's an external sense of condemnation when we violate conscience. Conscience is a priceless gift from God. Like touch, sight, hearing, and other senses, it protects us from harm. Just as through the physical senses we experience pain, conscience is a sense which protects us from moral harm and the consequent effects of that. Conscience is also about right and wrong. It is therefore the moral sense. Importantly, they note that Scripture attests to the fact that you can damage your conscience. You can sear the conscience. You can silence the conscience. And you can make a sick conscience. And here we have passages from 1 Timothy and Titus. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. And in Titus, to the pure, all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their minds and their consciences are defiled. By violating conscience and acting immorally, we can ultimately sear and burn off the conscience, muting it, rendering it insensitive to sin. Even within the secular literature, this phenomenon has been acknowledged. Robert Jay Lifton is a very famous psychiatrist of the latter part of the 20th century. And he spent a lot of time trying to examine the physicians who were involved in either the T4 euthanasia program or involved in the actual workings of the Holocaust, to try to understand how they could do this. What were they going through mentally and emotionally as they did this? And he called the process by which these physicians were able to sort of separate themselves from the grand traditions of medicine about not harming, not killing individuals. And he said that they went through a process called doubling, in which, in essence, they had to develop two personalities, two psyches. One that they employed when they were doing their actions at work, and the other, when they took that hat off, went home and put on to be loving husbands and doting fathers and good neighbors. But he witnessed within them this actual separation, if you will, psychically, of their personalities, and he called that doubling. Then Cardinal Ratzinger, ultimately Pope Benedict XVI, in a brief treatise called On Conscience, he talks a little bit as well about this damaging of the conscience. He said, the feeling of guilt, the capacity to recognize guilt, belongs essentially to the spiritual makeup of man. It is as necessary for man as the physical pain. Whoever is no longer capable of perceiving guilt is spiritually ill. No longer seeing one's guilt, the falling silent of conscience, is in so many areas is an even more dangerous sickness. He who no longer notices that killing is a sin has fallen further than the one who still recognizes the shamefulness of his actions. The silencing of conscience leads to the dehumanization of the world and to moral danger if one does not work against it. Now, associated with conscience and moral responsibility, moral accountability, is the concept of complicity or cooperation. Complicity can be defined as a collective wrongdoing, a partnership in wrongdoing. And we'll touch on this in more detail when we talk about requirements of dissenting physicians to refer for a specific act that they find heinous or wrong in and of itself. Complicity or cooperation can be broken down into some different specific categories. First, there's formal cooperation, where one intends the same object as the principal agent, that is, agrees with or encourages the act. It is morally wrong and never permissible. Then there is the category of moral cooperation, or material complicity, One does not intend the same object, but participates to some degree that accomplishes that object. And this is further subdivided into immediate material cooperation, meaning that the act is necessary to accomplish the aim, which is similar to formal cooperation, not permissible, and mediate material cooperation, which is supporting the activity, but is not necessary for it to occur. And in Roman Catholic moral theology, they would then analyze each episode of mediate material cooperation upon the same principles of double effect. The overall aggregate harms versus the goods, the intent of the agents, and a variety of those things to make a final determination. But as I will show you later on, I consider such things as a direct, meaningful referral as equivalent to formal cooperation, or at the very least, immediate moral cooperation, and therefore unacceptable. But this is going to pose some significant challenges to objectors in our changing society. I also want to acknowledge at the beginning that strong advocate of conscience protections that I am, there are significant challenges to conscience. One is the fact that it is potentially subjective and may lack norms of reference. It is one thing to claim that my objection is based upon a widely accepted point of view within a profession, within a religious tradition, and so on, as opposed to a very idiosyncratic claim that I am making right now, which would lead one to be concerned that this is just someone trying to get out of doing something. There's the lazy conscience, in which conscience is used as an excuse, which does no good for anyone, including the concept of conscience and those of us that are trying to defend it. As we've already discussed, consciences can be seared, they can become wrong or maleficent. And so the ignorant or sick or erroneous conscience is a challenge. Because there are individuals, as we will see from historical precedents, who had a socially re-engineered conscience, to support them doing heinous acts and feeling just fine about that. There is another thing within the clinical ethics environment which isn't a problem with conscience, but leads sometimes to a confusion of understanding certain terms. And one of those is moral distress. This became very clear to me when we had created our conflicts of conscience policy, and after having it online for 2 years, did a survey of, we wanted to know among the employees and so on, did they feel that our attempt to strike an appropriate balance between individual needs and institutional needs was indeed balanced? Did they understand what we were trying to say in a variety of things? What was very fascinating about this was that literally a third of the several hundred respondents to the survey took the time to write in examples of a conflict of conscience that they had experienced in their work. And yet, as I will show you, we had a fairly narrow definition, which involved being opposed to a specific action in all circumstances, that there was something inherently wrong with the act in question. Most of the stories that we received were indeed causing the individual's moral distress. They felt troubled. They felt that there was something that was wrong going on, but they didn't fall into that very limited definition, which we had to keep limited in order to be practical. What they were describing is more what has arisen from the nursing literature, but is now being recognized across healthcare professionals, is the idea of moral distress, where it's not so much that I'm being asked to do something that is inherently wrong and that I cannot do under any circumstance, but rather I am confronted with a situation which I know there is a correct solution, there is a right thing for us to do, but I can't do it because of policy, because the family is refusing to let us do the appropriate thing, because of the law or a variety of circumstances. So while the individual's conscience was responding and saying this is wrong, we wouldn't necessarily define that in the limited sense of a conflict of conscience, but rather fitting more into the category of moral distress. And that's a wonderful topic for a future conversation, but is an issue that those of us who talk about conscience run into. And then there is the issue of competing interests. Patients' needs, patients' desires is pitted against the practitioner's claim of conscience protection. The institution may have a need, on one hand, for ethical, trustworthy, conscientious employees versus the institutional need to provide legally permissible, patient-desired goods and services. And how do you strike that balance? And we will talk a little bit about that later on. There are some legitimate critiques about claims of conscience which are very troubling. There was an article a few years ago by Cook and Dickens in which they cited misuses of a 2004 Mississippi law granting conscience immunity, but the circumstances in which that law was claimed included a physician for refusing to undertake a life-saving procedure, which we would never consider in medicine as something one would conscientiously object against. A nurse refusing to undertake hygienic care of an abortion patient, or a hospital staff member refusing to serve meals to an abortion patient. In those situations, the individuals in question were not asked to directly participate in the objectionable act itself, but rather they were being asked to treat another human being in the same way that they treat every other patient that would be coming before them. And that is an abuse of the idea of conscience. Then there was the ambulance driver who refused to carry a patient believed to be suffering incomplete induced abortion. Again, at no point should a health care professional who has sworn to take care and protect the life and interest of patients refuse to participate in life-saving interventions regardless of what may have put the patient in danger in the first place. This is not an endorsement of the act that put the patient in that situation. It is now responding in the way that you promised to take care of individuals. Just a brief history in the United States. It's important for us to remember that many of our states came about as individuals were wishing to pursue freedom of conscience. Pennsylvania, for instance, founder William Penn, in his treatise, The Great Case of Liberty of Conscience, once more briefly debated and defended by the authority of reason, scripture, and antiquity, and so on. They had great titles back then. Or Roger Williams, Baptist founder of the Rhode Island colony, who had been persecuted and thrown out of Massachusetts for his faith. In his work, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Cause of Conscience, discussed at a conference between truth and peace. James Madison, who we remember as the author of the first amendments of the Bill of Rights, before that process wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, "Religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force and violence. And therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience." It's also interesting to note the first draft of the First Amendment. "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed." Now, in attempting to wordsmith and be a little bit more succinct, that was condensed to "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." But the free exercise thereof is clearly being understood by the authors as a protection of right of conscience. So conscience is a very fundamental aspect of who we see ourselves in this experiment in the United States. And for the students who want to really pursue this further, I strongly recommend a marvelous compilation by Dreisbach and Hall, The Sacred Rights of Conscience, which goes through all of the documents and so on of the founding era in this. In the Supreme Court case of Palco versus Connecticut, it was stated, "The freedom of thought is the matrix, the indispensable condition of nearly every other form of freedom. With rare aberrations, a pervasive recognition of this truth can be traced in our history, political and legal." Freedom of conscience is who we are. And some specific healthcare related cases from 1980, Harris versus McRae. The federal government does not have to fund abortion except to save the life of a mother, as a specific area of potential conscientious dissent. In Webster versus Reproductive Health Services from 1989, the court upheld a state statute that prohibited state-run medical centers from providing abortions except to save the life of the woman. So our Supreme Court has continued to recognize and defend within healthcare professionals a right of conscience. The AMA, albeit a shrinking voice in representing medicine, has also acknowledged that conscience plays a role in the healthcare professional's life. Medical schools should have mechanisms in place that permit students to be excused from activities that violate the student's religious or ethical beliefs. And neither physician, hospital, or hospital personnel shall be required to perform any act violative or personally held moral principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations also articulates a recognition of conscience and the duty to protect it. But as we go further, we speak of conscience as a right. We're very much in the United States a right-based society. We're always claiming, I have a right to this, a right to that. But what does that mean? Well, first, I think we need to make clear that there are two types of rights. I can go to Paige and other attorneys in the audience to either support me or tell me where I've gotten wrong. But in ethics and in the law, there are two types of rights to recognize. First, there are negative rights, which imposes duties of non-interference on others. This is actually where most of the First Amendments, the Bill of Rights, are often negative rights of interference. Positive rights, on the other hand, impose duties of assistance on others. And this is where we get sort of sticky in some of the current controversies over conscience in medicine. Do patients have a right to demand abortion and expect that that will be provided to them by all healthcare professionals? Do they have a right to demand contraceptive agents or Plan B, or, as may be the case in the near future, not only just a prescription for a physician-assisted suicide, but a lethal injection for euthanasia? And that's a very different sort of a claim. It's one thing to say, I have the right to be left alone. Okay, I have the right to refuse to do something that I think is wrong, as opposed to saying, I impose on you a positive moral responsibility to give me what I want. Those two have to be clearly understood as different claims. And we often get these confused with our very loose use of rights language. In healthcare in general, for instance, the negative right is well respected and understood. Patients have a right to refuse any and all life-sustaining treatments, which was based upon, by the courts, a right to be left alone, to personal bodily integrity, to forbid unwanted touching. And that's codified in some of our major decisions, particularly Cruzan and others, which have established that right. But the idea of asserting a positive right against medicine, unless you can claim that failure to provide a life-sustaining treatment or life-supporting therapy when it's not been refused, would be an abrogation of duty. That's a much, much harder claim to prove or to justify. I'm going to take you back to 1997, when the issue of physician-assisted suicide came before the Supreme Court in two cases that year, in which the question was, do patients, or should we say, does the Constitution recognize that a request of a patient for a lethal overdose or a lethal prescription is a constitutionally protected right? And the Supreme Court said no. That when we issued the Cruzan decision, which recognized the right to be left alone, we were in no way stating that this could be transformed into a positive claim. And as Rehnquist, writing for the court, said, In Cruzan, our assumption of a right to refuse treatment was grounded not on the proposition that patients have a right to hasten death, but on well-established traditional rights to bodily integrity and freedom from unwanted touching, the crime of which, unwanted touching, is called battery. Well, what about Roe versus Wade? Didn't Roe versus Wade establish a fundamental right for the claim of abortion? It did not. It again articulated a negative right. It forbade the state from making laws prohibitive of abortion under certain circumstances. They set the limit as the first trimester. But it did not establish a positive claim that a woman should be able to go to a physician and demand an abortion and receive it. This is why it's important to understand the distinction between a negative right and a positive right. And to express the fact that this is more of a negative right, we see a number of significant pieces of legislation over the years. The Church amendments from the 1970s disallow discrimination related to performing or assisting in abortion or sterilization. Protects both the abortion participants and non-participants. Stated that no individual shall be required to perform or assist in performance of any part of a health service program or research activity funded in whole or in part by HHS if contrary to his religious beliefs or moral convictions. In the Public Health Service Act of 1996, it disallows discrimination and the withholding of accreditation for not providing training, performing, referring for abortion. And the Weldon Amendment from 2004 onward disallows discrimination against any healthcare entity because it does not provide, pay for, provide coverage of, or refer for abortion. So if Roe versus Wade was establishing a truly positive right claim, these laws would have been overturned. However, we are engaged in a significant war on conscience. I'll start with the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology statement from 2007 and reaffirmed in 2013, entitled The Limits of Conscientious Refusal in Reproductive Medicine. They claim that the patient autonomy is the final arbiter for treatment, that the rights to refuse treatment equals the right to demand treatment. Clearly an ethical and a legal error. The right of conscience is just a personal opinion. That moral obligation is to the patient overrides a right of conscience. But what if I feel morally objectionable to the fact that this is what the patient really needs? We don't talk about that. That inconvenience imposes providers' beliefs on patients. Okay? That objectors, if they will not perform the act, must refer, and as we've already hinted at, this is a form of formal complicity and therefore morally unacceptable. If you can't timely refer, you must provide. And those who refuse to provide abortion should only practice in areas where abortion services can be provided by sufficient others. So now they're not only telling me what I have to do, they're telling me where I have to live. Then we can go to that moral exemplar of ethical rectitude, Governor Blagojevich, who engaged in his little crusade against pharmacists. He stated, pharmacists, like everyone else, are free to hold personal religious beliefs, but pharmacies are not free to let those beliefs stand in the way of their obligations to their customers. And his administration brought several suits against various pharmacists and pharmacies. Judge Gene Scott of the U.S. District Court for Central Illinois Springfield decision fortunately refused those cases. She stated that the pharmacist had brought a valid claim of alleging religious discrimination, and that the rule Governor Blagojevich had issued was issued specifically to force pharmacists with religious objections to Plan B or other forms of contraception to fill prescriptions for such despite those objections. It was a nice defense of the free exercise clause. In response to ACOG, in response to various cases like this, Secretary of HHS Dr. Mike Leavitt, before the end of Bush II administration, issued a regulation to implement conscience-protecting laws. After a 30-day public comment period, the regulation went into effect January 22nd of 2009. The rule stated that it was to prohibit discrimination in the employment, promotion, termination, or the extension of staff or other privileges to any physician or other healthcare personnel because he performed, assisted in the performance, or refused to perform, or refused to assist in the performance of any lawful health service or research activity on the grounds that his performance or assistance in performance of such service or activity, don't you love legalese? Anyway, would be contrary to his religious beliefs or moral convictions, or because of the religious beliefs or moral convictions concerning such activity themselves. And literally, within the first few days of the next administration, with a very, very troubled country at the time, one of the very first acts that President Obama did was to specifically halt that rule. It's very interesting, the intent of why that had to be one of the first activities that this administration focused on. Subsequent to this, none of the thousands of pages of the Affordable Care Act specifies or supports healthcare worker right of conscience. And in contrast, it mandates federal and private funds pay for abortion, overturning decades of protecting taxpayer freedom of conscience to be free from paying for voluntary abortion. We've had other luminaries who have gone as far as to simply state that deep-seated cultural codes and religious beliefs and structural biases, one of which is somehow a belief in the rights and humanity of the preborn, have to be changed. The current chair of the DNC issued last year a very strong statement stating that if you're going to be part of this particular party, you either support abortion or you get out. And I understand here in the election today, you have a pro-life Democrat who was abandoned by his particular party because he dared to conscientiously want to go a different way. The ACLU has openly declared a war against conscience. Their stated goal is to force all hospitals, including Catholic hospitals, to provide abortions. When religiously affiliated organizations, they write, move into secular pursuits, such as providing medical care or social services to the public or running a business, which, by the way, I'd like to challenge that in the first place. What is the origin of the hospital in Western civilization? The church. Okay? Who provides 1/6 of all health care in the United States? The church. All right? So medicine is not strictly a secular endeavor. There are secular institutions, but medicine is nowhere defined as a strictly secular endeavor. Sorry for the aside, but I think it's important to point that out, that these institutions should no longer be insulated from secular laws. In the public world, they should pay by public rules. ACL director at the time, Ira Glaser, said their ultimate goal is to eliminate conscientious exemptions. Measures that allowed hospitals, their staff, or any other person to opt out of providing abortions, sterilizations, or contraceptive should be opposed at all costs. And not surprisingly, they are joined by Planned Parenthood, who stated that while everyone has the right to their opinions about reproductive health care, including abortion, it is important to remember that the conscience that matters most belongs to the patient. Healthcare providers who object to providing certain services still have an obligation to respect the rights of their patients and to enable them to access the health care they need. Planned Parenthood has specifically opposed several hospital mergers between public and religious nonprofit hospitals because of the potential impact this might have on abortion delivery, forcing continued unnecessary duplication of the vast majority of other medical services. Do you understand what I'm saying there? By forcing institutions to remain separate for a given area, you are duplicating services. You're increasing the expense of health care. But abortion is the only thing that matters. Okay? It's also interesting to note that one of the proposals to try to diminish some of the conflict between pharmacies and patients when it comes to things like Plan B or contraception has been a proposal to make these agents over the counter so that they don't require a prescription. They don't require a pharmacist specifically to fill the prescription and render it. That would reduce some of the tensions, right? Planned Parenthood opposes this. Why do you think? Profits. They're more interested in profits than they supposedly are in protecting the reproductive rights of women. Well, this administration has decided not to play or continue what the previous administration had done, and they have recently created a new subsection of or division of HHS, the Conscience and Religious Rights Division, and they have engaged in, again, re-articulating conscience rights protection. It is very interesting to see that in the first month of operation, this office have received over 300 separate complaints of violation of conscience from healthcare professionals around the country. Not surprisingly, Cecile Richards feels that this is a wrong sort of thing. She states that it is shameful for doctors to opt out of performing abortions because of religious, moral, or personal objections. I will try to be kind here. But when you're faced by an organization of racist eugenicist roots whose founder wanted to exterminate the weeds of the poor, who has targeted African American communities specifically by their office placement, that has illegally sold fetal body parts, and an organization that knew about but did nothing to rein in the years of horrors of Kermit Gosnell, I just simply have to say, consider the source. Of course, the newspaper of note, the New York Times, came up with this recent headline in an editorial: "The White House puts the Bible before the Hippocratic Oath." Let's look at this. The Hippocratic Oath, which was a Greek document, as we all know, written 2,400 years ago, says, "I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury or wrongdoing. Neither will I administer a poison to anyone when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course, nor will I give to a woman an instrument," in other translations, a pessary, "to produce abortion." It is one of the promises that the medical profession has issued for over 2,000 years, which has allowed it to be trusted. It is the promise that we do not kill deliberately, that we do not murder. Now, admittedly, the Bible certainly supports that contention, but where are we coming up with this thing that we're pitting the Hippocratic Oath against the Bible? See, there's a very perverse understanding of what it means to be a professional at this point, and we will talk about that. But I have to share with you a couple of other interesting statements regarding conscience. This was in the Journal of Law and Medicine. The fact that it is doctors who are the most natural agents to administer the lethal treatment does not give them a significant standing in the decision whether to permit euthanasia. The mere participation or involvement by an agent in a morally questionable express practice does not, by that fact alone, entail that the interest of the agent ought to have a bearing on the moral status of the practice in question. Amazing. Amazing. Healthcare professionals are conscienceless automatons, according to this. I'm going to move forward. Canada, as we will hear a little bit more, is a real battleground for the issue of conscience right now. There was a case that involved a 25-year-old woman who could not obtain a prescription for contraceptives at a clinic because the physician did not prescribe them for reasons of medical judgment as well as professional ethical concerns and religious values. She obtained the prescription, there's the map, 2 minutes away. 2 minutes away. A crusade was started against the physician and two colleagues with the same views. The crusaders argued that in a secular state healthcare system, physicians should be forbidden to act on their moral or religious beliefs. This Canadian legal expert, Amir Adiran, says that doctors can't refuse to help a patient die no matter what they say. I don't know if you're all aware, but in 2016, the Canadian government passed a law permitting physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, for which there was significant concern among many of the physicians that they did not want to participate in this. Legal expert Adiran said, granted, some doctors conscientiously object to assisted dying, but if the situation arises, they cannot refuse to help their patients access what is now part of the legal standard of care. Anyway, those doctors whose conscientious objection to assisted death is absolute could always migrate into a specialty where the subject would never come up. Radiology, dermatology, pathology, obstetrics, well, then there's other issues there. Or any type of medical research. Why is the Canadian Medical Association fighting this? Simply put, some of its members are bigoted against patients who choose to die. And the CMA is siding with those bigots over their patients. Sorry for being snarky, but I'm concerned about the legal standards for attorneys in Canada, because the Carter versus Canada decision, which opened the door for the legalization of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, said, quote, nothing in the declaration of invalidity which we propose to issue would compel physicians to provide assistance in dying, and that, quote, a physician's decision to participate in assisted dying is a matter of conscience and in some cases of religious belief, unquote. Yet, in an act of treason against the medical profession and against patients, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario issued a statement stating that an effective referral must be provided by the physician who objects to killing their patient. An effective referral means a referral made in good faith to a non-objecting, available, and accessible physician, nurse practitioner, or agency. And then they clarify their position by saying the college does not consider providing the patient with an effective referral as assisting in providing medical assistance in dying. Well, this obviously betrays a complete and total lack of knowledge of morality or ethics, but it is a breathtaking statement of demanding complicity. Well, why not refer? Well, a referral means I endorse the competency, judgment, and ethics of the doctor I'm referring to. I would not refer to someone that I did not trust, nor that I believed would not provide the best care for my patient. As a referring physician, I enter into a professional relationship with them. I believe that they will not deliberately harm or kill. And consequently, if I refer to a physician who I know is going to kill that patient, it is a direct act of complicity in any way that you can understand that term. And despite that, an Ontario court just recently ruled that those physicians who oppose assisted death must refer the patient. It's a very clear example that the law is not necessarily ethical or rational, and that what is ethical is not necessarily legal. To make matters worse, Prime Minister Trudeau recently made a statement that an organization that has as its stated goal to remove rights from Canadians, and by this he's referring to any organization that might question the validity of abortion, okay, can't even talk about it anymore because you're in violation of the spirit of the Canadian Charter. So not only are we forcing people to violate their conscience, we've gone so far as to simply say, and don't even question. Don't even talk about it. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to fly through a few slides here, but there have been some prominent voices publishing primarily in the New England Journal of Medicine, which, by the way, is a very anti-conscience publication. One from legal expert Alta Charo, the celestial fire of conscience, refusing to deliver medical care. Basically, she's concerned that anyone who claims conscience should suffer. And she uses as an example Martin Luther King and the fight for civil rights, because King did claim conscientious objection to the laws that were discriminating against African Americans, rightfully so, but he was willing to go to jail. He was willing to suffer. So she's wanting to extend that willingness to be a normative claim, that individuals who claim conscience should suffer. They should pay for their effrontery in claiming conscience. I wonder how she actually deals with Reverend King's statement that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Then she says, for healthcare professionals, the question becomes, what does it mean to be a professional in the United States? Does professionalism include the rather old-fashioned notion of putting others before oneself? Should professionals avoid exploiting their positions to pursue an agenda separate from that of their profession? And perhaps most crucial, to what extent do professionals have a collective duty to ensure that their profession provides non-discriminatory access to all professional services? So I think this expresses a very commonly articulated but highly mistaken view of what a professional is. So if we recognize that medicine has been for over a century the paradigmatic profession from the perspective of sociology and a variety of other views of trying to define a profession, we recognize that it begins with literally an act of profession, a promise, a claim, okay? And for those individuals who make this claim, in the case of physicians, and for centuries, making the promise that I will not kill my patients, that I will employ my treatment for their benefit, not for their harm, that I will not engage in abortion, this group of claimants, of professors, is allowed by society to create their own code of behavior that is respected by the rest of society. Okay, so it's an extension to say that a procedure which has been now allowed to occur legally is professionally mandated. They don't directly lead from point A to point B. And yes, physicians profess to place the interest of the patient as one of the highest values, to the point of working long hours, of neglecting their family, of doing a whole variety of other things for the good of patients. But it doesn't translate into the fact that my concern for the benefit of my patient requires that I kill them or engage in a clearly unethical form of behavior. Similarly, Zeke Emanuel, the primary architect of the Affordable Care Act, and who recently stated in an Atlantic article that he wants to die at 75 and thinks you should too, co-wrote this article, Physicians Not Conscripts, Conscientious Objection in Healthcare, in which he states that physicians' ethical responsibility is to place patients' welfare above the physician's own self-interest. Therefore, there should be no claim of conscience. Well, actually, what that statement means, which he quotes from the AMA Code of Ethics, is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and to engage in non-discrimination of the patient based upon race, sex, age, financial wherewithal, social position, and a variety of those things. That's what that actually means. But he wants to go on and claim that abortion and sex changes are the basis of fundamental universal medical practice, which I would claim is not necessarily true. As a hematologist-oncologist, I have engaged in neither in the last 30 years. Okay. Nor do I see myself doing so in the near future. He also does not understand what it means to engage in an active profession and what that means. Then there's the Canadian philosopher, Udo Schooling, who has claimed and who had a substantial influence on the Canadian policies that doctors have no right to refuse medical assistance in dying, abortion, or contraception. And I like the way he views medical professionalism, that medicine is a service industry. Well, I agree, we provide a service. But so does McDonald's. So does Shopko or Target or whatever the case may be. We're not just a service industry. We are a profession who has an ethos which you can depend upon, or should historically have been able to depend upon. That is changing. So, admittedly, I mean, it's attractive to put on the wall of your practice, you deserve a break today, or have it your way, but that's not what medicine is. Well, I want to begin to share with you a little bit about what we've tried to do at Mayo. We began with a question: what do we expect from our healthcare professionals? We expect them to be competent and committed to maintaining competence. We expect them to be trustworthy, that they won't take advantage of us, our situation, or our vulnerability, that they are committed to confidentiality, that they are honest, even when uncomfortable or inconvenient, that they are dependable, that they're willing to advocate for us to our institutions, our insurers, the government, and society. That is, we expect them to have moral courage. We expect them to be compassionate, altruistic, committed to avoidance of unnecessary harm, non-maleficence, and committed to the patient's and co-workers' safety and well-being. In other words, we expect our caregivers to be individuals of high moral virtue, to be conscientious, and thus to have well-developed consciences. An individual who has the highest valuation of each human life is an employee who subscribes to concerns about patient welfare and society. But this is not what these folks I have quoted have in mind for a physician. Recognizing that my institution has had a very strong commitment to those virtues. When we first examined this back in 2002, it was my claim that the conscience and moral integrity of each individual Mayo staff member is one of the most precious resources the institution and each individual possesses. Again, we do not allow discrimination based upon these various attributes of patients. And we tried to sort out the difference about where the objection would occur. And while I will acknowledge that this is not a perfect formula, it was a place to start. That when we object conscientiously, we are objecting to an act, to the performance of a specific act that has moral import, not against persons. So we would stay away from the discrimination sorts of issues. And that was where our narrow definition that I referred to earlier came from, was that I would not do an abortion, period, except in the very, very rare circumstance in which it was indeed to save the life of one so we do not lose two. I would never directly kill a patient, okay? So those are acts that I am objecting to. And I can be very consistent to my employer that I am not going to do that in any circumstance. So how do you find that balance between, again, the organization's interest and the employee's interest? The employee has the interest of maintaining personal integrity, of maintaining professional competency, and performing meaningful work. The organization is interested in patient safety, providing excellent patient care, providing legally permissible goods and services, but also to employ and retain effective staff, those conscientious staff that I was talking about. And so, as we developed our policy, we wanted an environment where leaders would respect the importance of conscience, that they would prevent conflicts of conscience when possible, that they would take claims of conscience seriously, they would reflect and discuss the issues openly, and as they could, accommodate that conscience, admitting of exceptions. But that required an equal partnership from the perspective of the employee. That they would work collaboratively with leaders to prevent conflicts of conscience, that they would demonstrate good faith in recognizing the institution's need to fulfill obligations to patients, and to be forthright in recognizing, admitting, and reporting the existence or possibility of a conflict of conscience. Therefore, among the bilateral responsibilities, the employee would state their objections as early as possible in employment, so that supervisors would know and understand that there might be certain positions or certain duties that that patient should not be given. That they would do their best to avoid the situations, be prepared to accept alternate service, but still be committed to providing for patient safety and to become an active participant in the conversation. The organization, in turn, would respond by protecting patients' interests to develop a non-punitive environment, to regularly assess employees' potential conflicts of conscience, to engage in staff education about these concerns, and to distribute the burdens fairly. So far, it has worked pretty well. There are always interesting things about specific cases that will provide challenges, but at least our employees know that we value their moral integrity and that this is something that we can discuss and try to work out as constructively as possible. I'm going to end quickly here with a quick historical overview of what happens when medical professionals are stripped of their consciences. I'm passionate about history and what it has to teach us about ethical issues. As we are celebrating, if you want to use that term, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, we can, for instance, notice how the Russian society, the Soviet society, treated physicians and the idea of conscience. The first People's Commissar of Public Health in 1918 stated that they were proud to be the first nation in the world to actively legalize euthanasia, assisted suicide, and so on. But he said the first task of the so-called doctor's ethics is a political education of a medical doctor. In 1928, a Soviet physician said a notorious professional ethics was severely criticized because there should be only one ethics for everybody, Marxist-Leninist ethics. We should truly to Sovietize ourselves and subordinate all our activity to the interest of the new community. Only such ethics would guarantee us a proper place in the chain of the whole Soviet system. Not much room for conscience in this community. In China, during the years of the one-child policy, physicians were expected to forcibly perform abortions or terminations on pregnant fetuses if it violated the one-child rule. Back at the end of World War I, among the German medical community, one of their slogans was, "Eugenics is the highest form of ethics." In 1920, again, I'm trying to point out to here that this is well before anyone had heard of National Socialism. This was a society whose medical community had chosen to promote the virtues of the state over the patient. This was well established before anyone heard of a Nazi. In 1920, Host and Binding published their publication, Permission of the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, basically declaring that there were individuals that not only could be killed, but probably should be killed by the medical community because of the burden they imposed upon the state. And the propaganda posters were frequent, trying to show the substantial costs of the infirmed, of the disabled, compared to how this money could be used more constructively for the population. This poster states 60,000 Reichsmarks is what this hereditarily ill person will cost the national community over the course of his life. Citizen, this is also your money. And they considered these individuals, along with the Jews and other groups, as infections of the society that needed to be wiped out for the general public health. Surgeons of the Volk, as they called themselves. Going back to Robert Lifton in another publication of his, he said, "There is another dimension of medicalized killing, one that I believe is insufficiently emphasized. Killing as a therapeutic imperative. This kind of imagery was dramatically revealed in the words of an SS doctor in response to a question posed to him in Auschwitz by a distinguished surviving physician, Dr. Ella Liggins-Reiner. Pointing to the chimneys in the distance, she asked, 'How can you reconcile that with your Hippocratic oath?' His answer was, 'When you find a gangrenous appendix, you must remove it.'" So it's not strange that I am frightened by comments such as these. Dr. Troyan Brennan wrote in his book, Just Doctoring, traditional ethical notions must be modified because doctors can no longer say the patient comes first, for they must consider the hospital, the group practice, and the publicly improved reimbursement scheme. A new notion of medical ethics is needed which takes into account the virtues of the liberal state. I could not reply any better than Dr. Von Smith, writing in the British Medical Journal, "Since visiting Auschwitz, I have grappled with the questions of how I would have behaved as a doctor in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. I hope I would have had the moral courage to refuse to participate. My chances of behaving honorably would have been greatest if I had felt part of an independent medical profession with allegiance to something higher and more enduring than the regime of the day. And are there consequences, are there direct consequences to our patients, besides not being killed, mind you, of a lack of conscience in a society, in a profession? So we all know that euthanasia and assisted suicide have been allowed in the Netherlands since the 70s and legalized in Belgium and other jurisdictions. And I would say the majority of the electorate or the individuals in those countries favor the acts, but here's the concern. They know that physicians are killing patients, not by request, but by the specific decision of the physician and possibly the family jointly agreeing that this individual needs to die. Okay? It's very clear. 1 in 125 deaths in the Netherlands is by a physician killing a patient without request. Okay? So, the society worked very hard to override the conscience of physicians who were questioning this act, who were against this act. And the consequence of this is that a growing number of patients are afraid. They're afraid of their physicians. They're afraid to seek medical care. Some refuse hospitalization or nursing home placement. Some have tried carrying cards in their wallet, the declaration of the will to live, as opposed to our living will, which says that I don't want you to kill me, and hope that someone will respect that. Some go so far as to make the institution sign a contract with them that they will not be killed during that admission. To make matters worse, the Netherlands, and soon now the Canadian program, has implemented a program of organ donation by euthanasia, creating a clear conflict of interest for the state and for physicians to do this. And it's also not helping that there are these publicly published analyses by the Canadian authorities that have shown how much money they will save if we euthanize more patients. Leading individuals such as Christine Nagel to have tattooed on her arm, "Don't euthanize me." And she stated, financially, it will become the salvation to our overburdened healthcare systems. Our government and Supreme Court do not, of course, mention anything about money, but they do warn us that within a few years, seniors will outnumber the rest of the population and will need an army of caregivers to cope with them. That will be costly. Inevitably, euthanasia will become a more socially acceptable way to solve this problem. She already knows that if she leaves another advance directive, it will probably be ignored in that state. In our country, the disability rights groups are fighting the spread of states with assisted suicide laws. Why? Because they know that they will be preyed upon in a system that does this. So if you force physicians to violate conscience, if you force them to do what the state considers to be legal or in the best interest, regardless of the ethics of the act in question, clearly, demonstrably, unquestionably, this will take medicine from being the most trusted profession next to the clergy in the past to being a profession unworthy of trust, and justifiably so. And that, to me, to all of us, is a tragedy. A few final quotes. From freedom does not have a purpose, when it does not wish to know anything about the rule of law engraved in the hearts of men and women, when it does not listen to the voice of conscience, it turns against humanity and society. John Paul II. Denying one group of citizens the right to act on their conscience puts each citizen in jeopardy of losing First Amendment rights. Denying healthcare professionals the right to act on their conscience puts patients at risk of being cared for by those who are less than professional, those whose character attributes essential to quality care are compromised. This from a self-described pro-choice atheist. The extent to which an institution seeks to expunge individual conscience and moral autonomy is the extent to which it is totalitarian and dangerous. The idea that I resign my conscience to the institution or to the state is perhaps the single most pernicious notion in human history. It is at the heart of the wars and genocides of this century and the last. And my final slide. I have thought for a long time now that if someday the increasing efficiency of the technique of destruction finally causes our species to disappear from the earth, it will not be cruelty that will be responsible for our extinction, but the docility, the lack of responsibility of the modern man, his base, subservient acceptance of every common decree. The horrors which we have seen, the still greater horrors we shall presently see, are not signs that rebels, insubordinate, untamable men are increasing in number throughout the world, but rather that there is a constant increase, a stupendously rapid increase in the number of obedient, docile men. Men without chests, men without conscience. Thank you.